Well, there's been allegations against you vis-a-vis Epstein, and
Right?
you've always defended yourself quite vigorously, which I appreciate because I don't, when you get the no comment, it smacks to me of a possible guilt, but you've always been upfront about it. I don't know. I really don't know what to think of the whole file, or did he kill himself, or is Trump's name on there? Is this more of a Clinton thing than a
Well,
Trump thing? What do you
I,
think?
I can tell you a lot about it. First of all, the reason I spoke out is I have nothing to hide. I've never touched another woman or had even sexual contact with another woman since the day I met Jeffrey Epstein. I'm very happily married. I have been for 49 years, and I hope to continue to be married and love my wife forever. So I never had anything to hide. And the woman who accused me dropped all of her claims, all of her lawsuits, and ultimately admitted that she may have misidentified me and confused me with somebody else. So I have been, completely, found innocent of anything. So I have nothing to hide, and therefore I'm willing to talk about it. I've seen many of the Epstein files. I know who's in them, and I know there are many false accusations. For example, there's a woman whose name was Sarah Ransom, and she wrote 20 or 30, 40 emails to the New York Post to a reporter named Maureen Callahan, and said she had in her possession videotapes of Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Richard Branson, and others having sex with children. She said she sent copies of those videotapes to Russia for protection. Then when there was an investigation, it turned out the whole story was made up. Ultimately, she admitted she made up the whole story. So what worries me is that they often just release the accusations. Or, for example, there's another woman named Maria Farmer, who's been the star of CNN. She's been on CNN. She's been on the New York Times. People believe her. And yet everybody knows she lied, made up stories about things she couldn't have seen or heard, and is a rampant anti-Semite, believes that there was no Holocaust, believes that the Jews killed the Germans. And when she's on CNN, they don't mention any of these things. Or if the files are released, there would just be the accusations by these two liars, perjurers, people who should be in jail. But they don't give the background. So when you get a half-truth, sometimes a half-truth is worse than a complete lie.
So what's your head on? I've heard both sides. So one side says, what about the files? The other folks say, well, there's a lot of stuff in those files was victims and things of that nature, and we don't want to re-victimize the victims. And anything that's pertinent in there, you're aware of, and so there's no there. But what is your take?
And also, a lot of these victims are partial victims. They were victims, and then they became victimizers. They made false accusations, or they themselves served as pimps for young women and brought them to Jeffrey Epstein. So, it's a continuum. There are some purely innocent victims, and they should be protected. But there are a lot of gray area people there. For example, this woman, Maria Farmer, and the other woman, Sarah Ransom, they were in their mid-20s, and they were just overt perjurers, criminals. And they don't have to be protected. But the real victims have to be protected. In fact, the fake victims, like the two I mentioned, hurt the real victims because their lies have been exposed. And so people say, oh, my God, if these two lied, maybe others have lied. No, many others have told the truth, but some have lied. So I think everything ought to be released with very, very, very narrow exceptions for underage people who are really, really victims. But there are very few of those, I think.
So for the uninitiated who are constantly trying to wrap their mind around this, because it's a lot of, Trump's on that list, and then there's a lot of, Clinton's on that list, Bill Clinton. If you were just to assign a number, like I said Trump, 0 would be the lowest, and 10 would be a whole bunch of incriminating stuff on that list. And then I said Bill Clinton, 0 is nothing burger, and 10, obviously, a bunch of stuff. I say Trump, what number would you assign to that?
Minus 3 in terms of criminality. I mean, he knew Epstein before anybody had any suspicions that Epstein did anything wrong. That I've read about in the records. On the Clinton thing, I actually have firsthand knowledge. This is a name-dropping story, but I was having dinner with Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton while he was president of the United States at the home of Caroline Kennedy, who lives down the block from me. And before I defended Donald Trump, actually used to talk to me and her home. And so we were all there having dinner, and the Secret Service comes over to President Clinton and says, phone call. And President walks away for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. We all thought it was about national security. Comes back to the table and says, Alan, somebody wants to say hello to you. He hands me the phone. It was Jeffrey Epstein. So I have firsthand knowledge that President Clinton spoke to Jeffrey Epstein for 15 minutes. What did they talk about? I have no idea. What did he talk about with me? He asked me whether I was having a good time in the vineyard. So, there are many people who are on his plane. I was on his plane. Of course, I was his lawyer. And he would always send his plane for his lawyers. We had a special table on the plane. We would sit around and plan our legal strategy when we were negotiating the plea with the state attorney and with the U.S. attorney. And so, of course, I was on his plane probably a half a dozen times. So was Bill Clinton. I don't know about Trump. But none of this has anything to do with any criminality. And so I think the whole thing is largely a nothing burger. There may be a couple of names that haven't yet been made public and would be made public about people who went to his island when things were going on in the island that were improper. That's a possibility, but I don't think there's anybody famous, anybody who you know about, certainly nobody who's now serving in office or recently served in office who would become incriminated as the result of the release. That's why I'm so surprised they haven't released everything.
Well, what do you think? How do you think Epstein made all his money?
He was getting, as I understand it, 1% of the investments he made for Leslie Wexner. Leslie Wexner was at the time worth between, I think, $6 and $9 billion. Just do the arithmetic. 1% of that every year, buys you some pretty nice houses on nice islands in the Caribbean. So that's a possibility. I know he got a lot of money from a lot of wealthy people, giving them tax advice and other economic advice. I don't know what the advice is. He only gave me advice once, and he advised me to buy a certain mutual fund of stock, and it went to zero. So I have nothing but contempt for his ability. Fortunately, it was a small amount of money.
Where do you come down on the suicide versus somebody took him out in prison?
I don't think we'll ever know for sure, but my inclination is toward suicide with the help of prison guards. He couldn't have committed the suicide without them turning off the video, without them making sure they were away for a coffee at the time it happened. So I don't think it was just a suicide. And already we know that a couple of the people who were there at the time have been fired from their job. So that's my best guess, but it's only a guess. See, I didn't know him at the time. I had ended my contact. This is going to surprise people, but when I helped get the deal for him, where he was sentenced to 18 months in prison and had to register as a sex offender, everybody calls that a sweetheart deal in retrospect. At the time, Epstein hated it, and he fired me, and he refused to pay my fee. And so my relationship with him essentially terminated when I failed to get him out of prison and failed to get him not to have to register. So I didn't really have much contact with him after that. I did have some phone calls because he would call me about the case, but nothing substantial.